Welcome, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. I'm excited, as always, to introduce our guest to you. It's one we've had on the show before. But before I do, I want to thank some people that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com, a Quinn the Eskimo company. Brass and Winds are where we get our brass and woodwind instruments. They're fantastic people. They can help you in any way you could possibly imagine. Please feel free to give them a call, brassandwinds.com. If you want to study with us, there's two ways. Truer MU is a series of video lessons. We think it's the quickest way to learn piano, and you can start for free. Or if you want to contact us to learn in person, come to the Willow School at willowschoolga.com. Willow Music, where we have instrument instruction in almost any instrument you can imagine, and we'd love to talk to you. Speaking of talking, for those of you that keep track of this channel, you may have caught our interview or will be catching our interview with Tom Werman, producer. He produced 23 gold and platinum albums by acts like Mother's Finest, Motley Crue, and Cheap Trick, among others. And he was kind enough to talk with us about a month and a half ago about his whole career. It was really fun. And then, to my surprise, he wanted to talk some more, and I had some more questions for him. So we agreed to talk again. Tom Werman, welcome back.
Thanks. I can't stop talking.
Well, we're going to milk that for what it's worth.
By the
This
way,
time, yeah, go ahead.
I just have to clarify one thing. There were 23 gold and platinum records, but they did include 3 or 4 best ofs.
Okay.
Which
Well, that's
also
honest of you.
gold and platinum. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But that still counts because, you did the work. So,
Right. Right.
well, this time around, last time we talked about your career in its whole trajectory. This time, since I'm lucky enough to get you back, I want to go deeper. I have a lot of questions about, in particular, the art of production, producing music, and your take on it. I have lots of questions. Let's start with something general. In your opinion, what does a good producer do?
Everything from right from the beginning, listening to the material, helping to choose the material with the band, arranging the material, rehearsing, putting the songs into really lean and mean structure. So get rid of the fat, kind of feature the meat, um, the wheat from the chaff, and get the right recording engineer. Get that. This is all 70s and 80s talk,
Right.
not today, obviously. Today producers create beats, and I don't really know very much about it, but I really like the way we used to make records.
Well,
That they were human and they breathed and they had warts and all.
if it makes you feel any better, we interviewed a producer who's working today, a younger man, and
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
name is Ian, and he talked about producing the same way you did, about working with artists, helping them to come to the right places. So the act of production is still alive the way you remember it.
Yeah. Well, it's after you get ready, continuing what a good producer does. You book a studio, you book the right studio for the right operation, so that when you do the basic tracks, which is basically drums, bass, and rhythm guitar, with a model vocal, a dummy vocal, so you know where you are in the song. You need usually a big room for that, for both the sound and for isolation, being able to have the band all play together if they want, and to have them also be isolated from one another sonically, so that one guy's instrument doesn't bleed into another guy's microphone. Um, and then you build the song. That's the way I did it, was to kind of make a pyramid out of it, where the foundation was a strong drum and bass track, a rhythm track, and then you just add and add. And it is the bands almost everyone would come in and say, we want to record live, because
Right.
they thought that was credible, and that it was a cop out to record any other way. And I said, well, you've spent most of your professional life trying to hear yourself over everybody else when you play live. And even though each band member had his own mix in the studio, um, they didn't understand how the microphone listens in a recording studio, and that it is well, it's microscopic. It's anyway. I'd say, look, that's not the way I would do it. But if you'd like, you go out there and we'll do some tracks. We'll record a few takes of a song you want to do, and then you'll come in and check it out. And we did that. And when they came in, there was this look of horror on their faces because they just didn't know how many clams, they produced during one take, and how rough they really were. And even live albums were not redone, not re-recorded, but pretty substantially polished in the studio. And I mean, pretty much everyone. And, that includes,
Frampton.
I'm
Frampton
guessing
stays alive.
the Who, all that stuff. It's
Yeah.
just too good. You don't get that kind of performance live. I remember when I first started to go to concerts by big bands, um, we'd get to the chorus and I'd say, what the hell, what happened to the chorus? Where are all those glorious angelic voices? you know, and I don't know, some bands, I guess, had singers off stage. Some bands had keyboard players off stage. Anyway, so then you mix. I used to do all the percussion after we were finished recording. There are special ways to do all the things. I won't go into it. Special ways that I had to make it quick and easy for the vocalist so that he wasn't out there singing the same song 20 times, trying to get it perfect. I made it pretty quick for him.
You can't talk about that at all. I'd love to hear just a little about that.
Well, okay, it's I'd take a lined sheet of paper and I'd write line by line the lyrics, and I'd make 3 columns on the left, and just number them 1, 2, 3, and I would have the vocalist record 3 tracks, and then I'd say, go take a rest, go out, play some video games or whatever. And the engineer and I would sit down and call the best lines or even words, and just make little X's, and then we would make a composite track of those 3 tracks. And then I'd bring him in and have him do 2 more tracks. And then we'd put those in to the composite track, so it would be pretty good. Mm-hmm. And then I would just highlight the words or lines or half lines that still needed work. And I would say, here's where we're going to go in, here's where we're going to come out, just sing along. And we'd patch it. So really, he'd sing the song. He'd only really have to sing the song 5 times. And that was it. We usually got everything. One day, I do remember one day when Vince Neil had been partying heavily the night before, and he was always really game about giving it his best shot. But we got 1 word. We got 1 word in like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
It was just terrible.
Well, I like this approach because it means that the vocalist never gets sick of the song, doesn't have time to get sick of it. So you're able to get a take that sounds really genuine out of these 5 or 6 versions.
Right. And also, you try to do that when we rehearsed and rearranged the songs in the rehearsal studio. We would record what we did, and not every, just one version, the changed version, the studio ready version. And then we'd be able to refer to that when we got into the studio. It might be 2 or 3, 4 weeks later. What did we do to that song? I can't remember. Oh, well, let's listen to this. But in rehearsal, you really, I never rehearse lead breaks, solos, or vocals. just the bare minimum. It's like, okay, here, let's maybe change that um, crash cymbal to a ride cymbal or hi-hat, whatever. You make little changes because you do not, as you say, want to bore the hell out of the band or the performer. You want to still have a little bit of spontaneity in the performance.
Yeah. Speaking of that, in my research, I discovered that, a lot of famous albums were recorded somewhat live. Highway 61 Revisited, for instance, and Zeppelin apparently was famous for only doing 4 or 5 takes. So how do you square that? Obviously, new days required new situations, but how do you square that?
Well, they could do 4 or 5 takes, but then there are the fixes.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, I did a live album with Jeff Beck, and he's very good, and it was with Jan Hammer, the Jan Hammer band, and Jeff, and we still. I remember we went into Alan Toussaint's studio in New Orleans and did a number of rough mixes. We picked the ones that the live recordings that we felt were the best performances, and we fixed his solos. I mean, there were clams where he could do better.
Yeah.
You know, um, and it was live. I mean, it was a live album. So you work it out. Um, you know, when I did Ted Nugent double live Gonzo in the 70s, I had 3 different audiences. So there was one with whistles and fireworks. There was one really just yelling and screaming. And then there was one with a lot of applause. And I mixed them up and brought them up and down and during the song and mainly after the song, and you can hear stuff. Let's see, what was it? There's some of the Stone stuff. It's obvious that they're really, juicing the. It was Sympathy for the Devil live at Madison Square Garden and Get Your Yayas Out, and you can hear afterwards. It's like the the audience is twice as loud and big as the song. Yeah. Anyway, so
Yeah. Yeah.
and then
Well,
beyond, just let me go
please.
one step further after you mix, which is really tough. Sometimes it's fun. Usually it's a grind. Then you go to mastering. You go to the mastering lab, and that's the last chance you have to deal with the sound of the record. And it's kind of like peeling off a layer of sludge. When you bring an unmastered tape into the mastering lab and then you walk out with, in those days, a cassette of the mastered record, it's like it's like a new piece of work. It's that much better if you have a good mastering engineer. And I always use the same one at Sterling Sound in New York, George Marino. Anyway, that's
Great.
about it. Then you deliver the record and go on to your next project.
Who are some of the producers that you love, some of your favorites, and do you know if they work differently than you do?
Oh, I'm sure they did. I sat in on some of Jack Douglas's sessions early on. Aerosmith, that was exciting, and Cheap Trick, the first record he did. Um, my inspiration was Glyn Johns, because before I even knew really what a producer did, I saw produced by Glyn Johns on the back of the Eagles' first album
Mhm.
with Take It Easy and Who's Next. And I said, good God, this guy's good. If he can go from that to that, what a range that is. And, obviously he did a whole bunch of other wonderful things. Um, Mutt Lang, grade A, perfect, geez, I can't remember the guy, and I met him and he had dinner at my house. But at my age, the memory is going. He did Seal. He did Crazy by Seal.
Yeah.
well, I think that's about the most well-produced song I've ever heard. Um, you know, there were many. There were many. Richard Perry did some fantastic work with with the Pointer Sisters. A, a lot of great producers out there. Roy Thomas Baker. The Queen stuff was just ridiculous. It was, there were great producers you know, who made me feel pretty humble.
Here are some of my favorites, and I'd like to know what your opinion is of them.
Okay.
Rick Rubin, Phil Ramone, of course, George Martin, and Hugh Padgham. Those are some of the ones who put out albums that I'm like, wow, this is right in my sweet spot.
Yeah, well, Padgham, I think.
Mhm.
I think it was DGHAM. I can't remember what he did. He didn't do the Police, did he?
He did some work with Sting. I think he did some
Yeah.
work with ELO. I think he produced the Skylarking record by XTC.
Yeah. A lot of the people who were the first couple you
Rick
mentioned?
Rubin,
Oh yeah.
whenever I hear Rick Rubin's production, he takes an artist who everybody thought was gone and he brings them back. It's pretty astounding.
Yeah, I really not, I'm sure I know a lot of the albums he did, but I don't connect his name to that. I was once very early on, early in the South by Southwest Music Festival, when there wasn't a movie festival yet. We were on a panel together, and I said something about producing, or I liked this record that he did or whatever, and he said, basically, I really don't know what I'm doing. I think we all feel a little bit like that, but he was particularly good with relating to the artist. You know, obviously, I'm much better than I was. Some of my artists just were a real problem. You know? And George Martin, just, what can you say?
Yeah.
I spent some time with him in that he produced Blow by Blow, I think, by Jeff Beck, and I had prepared an edit for the single, and I took it to his office when we were in England for a convention, and he was extremely generous with his time, and he gave me tea in his office. He played the edit. He liked the edit. He said, "Let's walk down to the studio and cut, a copy of the master." I was walking down, I don't know, the King's Road. I can't remember exactly where it was, to George's studio, Air London studio, with George Martin. And I just wanted to jump up in the air. Look, I'm with George Martin. Yeah. Anyway, he was great. One interesting thing was that after the three Cheap Trick albums I did, they chose to go to George Martin for the next one, and it wasn't anywhere near as successful as the ones I did. And that kind of, I
Right.
kind of liked that.
But we're going to talk about that later, but it is a very good album. I really enjoyed it. It's quite different from the ones you did. We can talk
Yeah.
about that later when we talk about Cheap Trick.
Yeah. Okay.
It's so we talked a little bit about live albums, and we talked about bands recording live. When I grew up at a time when the music I liked was by bands that were too big to go see anymore. They were all at that point either retired, dead, or doing arenas only. So I never really got to have a relationship to bands live. So it was all through albums.
Yeah.
I'm an album guy. Essentially, my relationship to almost all my bands is through their albums, and in particular the arc of the albums as I've gotten older, listening to all of them. Talk, if you can, about the relationship between bands live, how they are live, who they are live, versus who they are in albums. Is it always sort of the same relationship, or are some bands really more album bands?
Well, I think almost every band before, well, first in the 50s, Elvis, and I think probably everybody right up to the mid 60s was pretty live. You know, there were good musicians in there. You can hear all kinds of mistakes and sometimes things that weren't supposed to be on there. And then later on in the 90s, that came back, you know, and bands really rebelled against the corporate sound, which was polished and tailored and really, really well, you know, everything was formed perfect. And there are a lot of bands who were some of the metal bands were probably a little more live than album. I mean, and you've got stuff like maybe gee, the Eagles were un, absolutely um, they were they were perfect. They were certainly perfect on record. They were close to perfect on stage. They basically reproduced the record live, and it
Yeah.
was thrilling. A lot of people gave them shit for that. They, you know, they said, well, you know, they don't move, they don't, because they would come on stage sometimes and sit in a row of on a row of stools and just and play. But it was fantastic to hear it live. They're perfectionists. Um, and as you said, maybe I didn't know about Zeppelin, but you know, there is a quality to you know, let's just go through it once and see what happens. Especially if you're, you know, the Beatles, for instance. I saw them, and I saw them at the Late Show at Carnegie Hall, and that means we heard them. They were audible. There were very few screams in the audience because it was late, and all the young girls had gone to the early show. So we were very lucky. It was I was in 1964, and they were just tight as a drum because they've been playing, you know, they've been playing that set for years, years and years, and you know, they wrote these great songs and played them for years and years and years, and then when they became huge, they had to write a lot of other songs in a hurry. meanwhile, meanwhile, they had been playing all these songs till they you know they could play them without hearing almost. I mean, it was so automatic. Um, One of the great you know things about them was that they were that good, and then George Martin, you know, put his magic on it, and they experimented with recording techniques and new techniques and all this wonderful stuff. It was hard to beat them. The Stones really didn't care. You know, they were attitude. I mean, Keith Richard is not a great technician. He's not. Uh, well, let's see. Don Felder. You know, he's not Joe Walsh, but you know, he does it all with attitude and tuning. And, you know, he's really a bit. He doesn't care. He just doesn't care. You can hear all kinds of mistakes and stuff, which he, you know, he wouldn't say, let's fix this. Let's fix this before we mix it. He's just like that. That's good when you're the Stones.
Yeah, right. So what is it? Why is that true when you're the Stones? What's going on?
Well, they're just they're unique and they're very good. And Keith composed the greatest guitar licks in the history of rock and roll. I mean, there are gazillions of them. Every Stone song is formed around one of Keith's rhythm guitar licks, or two of them, or three of them even. You know, just you think the way every Stone song opens, it's a fabulous Keith Richard guitar lick.
Yeah.
You know, he's amazing. Um, that's why they're so good. He doesn't have to fix it. It's just that good. And also, you know, he plays the five strings, and nobody could figure that out for decades. We tried to cover the Stones, and you said, yeah, no, that was good, but it just didn't sound quite right because it wasn't tuned the way Keith tuned it.
Ah. Well, to get ready for this interview, I did a lot of research and I played a little game. And I took 3 bands that you produced and I listened to the album before you produced it,
Huh,
then the album that you produced, and then the albums after you produced to
wow.
to try to really kind of get a sense of, what your bit was, how you
Yeah,
contributed. And I want to talk about that. So we're going to start with Poison. Uh, this is a band I had never heard, except for Every Rose Has Its Thorn. I'd never heard any of their albums. And I
yeah,
really, really liked this band. I was quite surprised how much I liked them. To sum up, Look What the Cat Dragged In was their first album. And
yeah.
apparently it was supposed to be a glorified demo. It's really not so much an album as something they just released. Then you did Open Up and Say Ah, which Paul Stanley was supposed to produce, but you get to produce. And then they released after you, they released Flesh and Blood. Fairbairn produced that. And to my surprise, all 3 albums to me sound very good. They all sound very polished. They all sound very, and the band too, I know they're a metal band, but I swear they're a pop band. I
They are.
mean, yeah,
Yeah, they're a power pop, like
right.
Cheap Trick. They may have wanted to be metal, but they're a power pop.
Yeah.
That's what I like. I love power pop. I'm not a metal guy. People say, "Oh, yeah, metal." No, no. Be, even with the harder bands, even with artists like Ted Nugent, even with Motley Crue, my what I did was to get the pop out of them, and seize on the pop, exploit it, feature it, and make hit singles.
Yeah.
And it's the only way you can make hit singles. You couldn't make hit singles with hard metal songs back then. Just couldn't. They wouldn't play it. They'd play it on FM. So
You
that was
better explain that to a lot of our listeners. They don't understand what you mean.
AM.
Everyone's on, yeah, AM, FM.
Well, there were 2 bands on the radio. If you had a radio in your car, in your house, um, the AM stations all over the country played pop hits and had a lot of advertising. The FM stations were much more underground. They were hip. They had fewer advertisements. They played albums. They played album tracks that were not edited. They'd play a 7-minute album track where AM radio would never allow that. And they would play the edited version, which would probably be just a little over 3 minutes, because they could make more money. The shorter the songs, the more advertising time you would sell. So, you in the 70s, you get a nice kind of artsy band from England, who would make a really good album and it would get really good reviews and great word of mouth, and it would sell 700,000-800,000. If that same album had a hit single that would be played on AM radio, it could sell 3 million albums. And this is why I made singles, basically, because that's what I was asked to do also by the labels. And it was my pop ear. If Motley Crue played Girls, 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 right away I'd say, oh, let's work with that, and instead of maybe the Heaven Tonight by Cheap Trick could never be a single, but we did. I enjoyed it and did what I could for it, but it was always going to be strictly FM. Always, you'd never hear that on pop radio. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, there were programmers who were hired by a number of stations, maybe a chain of stations that was owned by one company or one guy. And he would create playlists, and all of the stations would play the same playlist. in different order. But if if you had if some label put out a song and it was on Bill Drake's playlist, his sheet, you get a sheet of eligible songs. It was a hit because every station, every station that paid him to advise them would play it, and and it would be like 10 times a day, and people would run out and buy it. So that happened, and then mergers and acquisitions, and eventually AM and FM disappeared. FM became much more commercial. But anyway, we listened to our FM stations. They broadcast in stereo. The AMs didn't. And you'd sit down with earphones, and turn on the radio. And I remember listening a lot to FM stereo on earphones and hearing the music come over the airwaves. They had these very powerful compressors. They compressed the sound, and you could almost hear it breathe, because compressors would squash the loudest sounds and amplify the lowest sounds. And so you could hear everything, and it sounded like it was a perfect mix all the time. You could hear everything. And I said, gee, I'm making these records. There's something I just don't understand. My records don't sound like that. And everybody else's, they sound so good on the radio. And finally, I heard one of my songs that I had produced on the radio on an FM stereo. And I went, whoa, this is really good. It was so different from the unbroadcast, the version you'd play in your living room on your phonograph. Yeah.
Talk more about Poison and what you felt like you could bring to that second album. As we said, the first album was very good. So what did you think you could do for them?
Well, again, hits. They were a challenge. They weren't. They admitted they're like Ricky Rocket always said, "I'm not the greatest drummer in the world, but I tried." And he was a very hardworking drummer, and he wasn't the greatest drummer in the world, but he put his soul into it. I didn't have. I had a guest harmonica player on that album, and I think that was the only one. He didn't play all the parts that Brett played, but he did play some of them. And I had a couple of backing vocalists who did the choruses with Brett. And I guess some of the others, some of the other guys sang too. But the idea was to get hits, help the band be what they wanted to be. Every Rose was a bit of a stretch because I really tarted it up. I was, the first time I heard it, I said, "Whoa, this is definitely a hit." I actually thought it was a country hit, but when I arranged it and I started to put oohs and ahs there and a couple of synthesizer pads and stuff like that, little thunder here. I called it the kitchen sink approach, and I really made it the kind of record with the oohs and ahs that threatened whatever street credibility that the band had. So we had to be careful about that. But yeah, pop album, no question about it.